On behalf of the department and the department's lecture committee, I want to welcome you to tonight's presentation. Just a couple little announcements. For those of you that are AIA members, there'll be a continuing education sign-up list here that I'll leave over here to the side at the end of the presentation tonight. Tonight's presenter, James Wines, who is president, founder, creative director of Site Environmental Design Inc. in New York City. I've known James for about 10 years, but I knew of his work way before that. And what I really appreciate about his work is the interdisciplinary relationships that he develops with other artists and with other architects and landscape architects. And his approach is really interdisciplinary. And you'll get that feel tonight. James was educated at Syracuse University with a Bachelor of Arts, where he studied sculpture, art, and literature. And he has received numerous international awards. He has two very well-known books, in addition to others, E-Architecture in 1987 and Green Architecture in the year 2000. He's lectured at more than 1,000 different conferences, universities, and a number of places over the years. He's won over 25 national and international awards. And just to give you a sense of some of the grants and fellowships that he's received, I need some notes for this, just because there are quite a few of them. He is a recipient of grants and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Press Foundation, the American Academy in Rome, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Grant Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Pulitzer Prize for Graphics. So obviously, you know, he's been quite successful in what he does. What I especially appreciate about James is that not only is he, as you'll see, sort of a provocateur, but he is a visionary in many ways, but he's a visionary that's just not about ideas. He's somebody that actually gets his ideas built in many, many cases. In other cases, we'll talk about ones that didn't get built tonight. But it's very unusual to have somebody that has such vision that can actually translate that vision into something that's going to be reality. He's also been working quite closely today, knowing that he did 30 years ago do some big boxes, and I'm teaching a big box studio. So we were able to get him into the studio today and have a little workshop and talk about that. And I think the conversation was actually quite good today. And part of the idea of the big box studio is just dealing with issues of sustainability and the implications of what the big box phenomenon is. And that's what the focus of his presentation is going to be on tonight, in addition to giving you an overall sort of general sense of some of the issues that he thinks is very important. So I would like you to join me in welcoming James Wines.
Well, thank you really very, very much. For those who might know me a little better, like Michael, I'm a great gourmet. I mean, famous chefs tremble when I walk in the door of a restaurant. And so this whole process is a process of forgiveness, because Michael took me to a bad restaurant in Savannah, and I've never forgiven him until today. And, but I heard that he was doing this big box thing, and I thought, well, there's a core of all of our ecological and environmental problems in one place. So I really had to come. I haven't talked a lot about this subject, you know, for quite a few years. My firm got its beginning in the big box world. But I'm really very happy to be here. I'm plugged in at about 5 different places here. You know, they got me hooked in, I guess, to about 5 different rooms. I sort of drew the line when the technician came up with a rubber glove and the Vaseline, though. I mean, that was enough, you know. So, at any rate, with technology, it's just so funny that when you're on the lecture circuit, you know, there's these state-of-the-art theaters where you step up, and I was one of, 5 or 6 years ago, where I looked down, it was like a 747 dashboard. And it was really intimidating. I mean, you know, I was trying to sort this thing out. They just put me on the stage, and they took my computer away, and they just left me there with this dashboard. And I was surveying this thing, and you know, they had things like lights up, lights off, lights on, dimming, you know, projector on. And I was looking overall, and then there were two little buttons at the corner of this dashboard. One was women's washroom and men's washroom. And this haunted me for this entire lecture, because I couldn't imagine what you would want to do from the podium that would in any way affect these two facilities, you know. So my fingers just hovered above these buttons because I was dying to push one to see if somebody was ejected backstage, or I had no idea what would occur. Anyway, well, tonight this economy of means lecture is part of a big series I'm doing now. And so it's kind of the beginning of everything I'm talking about, because it's obviously based on the economy. I often have controversial titles for my lectures, but tonight I thought this one was fine. I called my office today, and I'm supposed to talk to some business group, and they don't like the doing more with less in trying times, because we said we don't want to be reminded we're in trying times. And anyway, but that reminds me of a particular lecture. You know, I guess everybody does this too. When you're young and full of salt and pepper, you want to be even more controversial than you are. But, and everybody's always done this thing that where you can't imagine what you were thinking on that day to do anything this stupid. But I was asked actually to be at a conference that was in Los Angeles for the urban planning of the city or something like that. But my co-speaker at that time, this is about 25, 30 years ago, was Lou Kahn, who of course I had great respect for. So I guess they wanted a big establishment figure, and then they wanted a young firebrand on the other side. So I had read in the LA Times that there was a huge problem with urban planning there, that they were being accused of corruption and everything else in the world, and it was, you know, bad scene. And so I thought of this, what I thought at that time was a great title, Master Plan or Masturbation. So I fired off this idea, you know, to the, you know, LA government. I mean, it was actually, the sponsor was, I can't remember, one of the big energy, well, that was one of the biggest energy, the power company in Los Angeles was the sponsor. So they got this title, and and the conversation on the phone, I'm only paraphrasing because I can only, you know, think of what the guy really meant. The president of the company, the power company, called me, and I guess he didn't want to hurt my feelings or something. So he felt he should be diplomatic, and he should somehow explain why I should change this title. He didn't say, James, please change the title because we don't like it. So he started with, well, he said, what was the first one? He said, well, they were doing these embossed invitations, these old English, and, you know, in gold letters. He said somehow the word masturbation did not fit well onto the page. That was the first reason for not using that title. And the second was, he said, yeah, I said that you know, we're the power company, and you know, we have a lot of problems that people are criticizing for wasting energy, and there's something about your title that implies a waste of energy, of valuable resources, you know. and then the third reason, and this, again, I'm only speculating what he meant, but what he seemed to be saying was that, you know, masturbation was really an East Coast phenomenon and would have no relevance on the West Coast. So I left it at that. I changed the title to something else. Anyway, let's get on with this. But the subject, as I say, is under the economy. So the first part of this will have to do with the economy and the situation we find ourselves in. And then, as I say, since I started my career in the big box world and haven't had much to do with it, it's sort of the enemy camp, really. When I think about it, we've been doing mostly green work since then, in the last decade or so, and mostly out of the country, where there seem to be greener governments or greener policies. But we started there, and I was kind of forced to go back and rethink that whole era, because, and I thought about Michael's project, which is the fundamental essence of the problem in this country: sprawl and car traffic and the ugliness of the suburban urban environment, mainly suburban environment. So he's tapped into a subject that is very profound and needs a lot of work, to say the least. Let me sit down. I had back surgery recently, so I have to kind of sit perch on this thing without falling off here. Or becoming unplugged, God forbid. All right. When I talk about economy means, I'm not really just discussing, conserving materials or money necessarily, although that's part of it. The most importantly, it's the product of a reductive aesthetic sensibility, a special gift of imagination that can transform a condition of frugality itself into an inspirational source for art. And that's a quote from an article I wrote for a book recently. And because I think too often everything is based on economy. We had a discussion this afternoon, and experts in the shopping center world were saying, well, everything is based on the system and the economy and what will make profit and so forth. But I think imagination often is outside of that, even though it feeds into it. And clearly what's happened in architecture over the last 20 years is the polar opposite of economy of means. I mean, it's just ghastly, really, in a way. And why every city in the world has to have a mile-high tower, I don't know. I think it's all these under-endowed architects who are trying to show off or something. But anyway, there's the tower idea is there, and billions of dollars spent, and endless wastes of energy, and it goes on and on. And unfortunately, it started in the industrial age, which started modestly enough, but even the Eiffel Tower was considered controversial. Many of the art community, interesting enough, in Paris objected to it as a force in the community. But anyway, it brought about the industrial idea, it brought about new technology. And I'm sure if we were talking back in 1889, I'd be sitting here promoting the industrial world. So the first part of this, may seem a little redundant, but I'm getting to a point. I mean, I'm sure you all know art history, so you don't have to be told again. But clearly, some of the greatest inventions of the 20th century, the ones that had the most resonance and longest influence, were very, very economical. Pablo Picasso and collage particularly. Picasso himself said, forcing yourself to use restricted means is a sort of restraint that liberates invention. It obliges you to make the kind of progress you can't even imagine in advance. And I couldn't agree more. With collage, he changed the entire perception of the painting on the wall. I mean, you can imagine the euphoria that the artist must have felt. He was probably, materials were his problem. They were too expensive. Paint, canvas, all that stuff. Where am I going to get it? I don't have any money. Looks down on the floor, picks up scraps, pastes them down on wood, a wooden board. I think it was 1911, the first collage. Painted into a little bit. Suddenly began to realize that he was dealing with illusion and reality as simultaneous events, and totally revolutionized visual art. And that cost nothing. It was the cheapest thing he could have possibly done. Another artist with similar motivations was Marcel Duchamp, who wisely said, I taught myself to contradict myself in order to avoid conforming to my own taste. A brilliant statement if there ever was one. And then he said, I'm interested in ideas, not merely visual products. Well, at that time, coming from the 19th century into the 20th century, everything was about product. Paintings in museums, sculptures on bases, everything in the museum was about product, just as it is now, the price of the product and buying and selling the product and so forth. So when he introduced a urinal into an art gallery, I mean, that shattered the whole context. Imagine, I always say, for example, an artist like Henry Moore could keep on making these big, cumbersome objects if he wanted to, but at least by putting a urinal next to it, Henry Moore was compelled to make something at least as interesting as a urinal. And that wasn't difficult because the urinal in the art gallery displaced the whole idea of what should be there. It made you reevaluate the context. And that's the genius of Duchamp. A mustache on a Mona Lisa, taking a sacred icon and changing its context and meaning. His roulari door, I always love this. It's such a brilliant idea. He had a door, or he had two entrances, one on the bathroom and one on the kitchen, so he made one door. And he said, well, the reason I made one door, he said, everybody has a door that's either open on the kitchen or closed on the bathroom or the reverse. Here's a door that's open and closed simultaneously. So it's always open and closed. And he worked with ideas. In other words, this is something we talked about this afternoon, is that the poverty of ideas in the shopping world, in the big box world, is basically the problem. As I say, if we were back in the industrial age, we'd be celebrating different things. I love this etching because the celebration here is smoke. Lots of pollution. That shows productivity. So they celebrated it then. I mean, if you wouldn't have a factory without showing the smoke coming out of the chimneys. So it's a totally, now we're in a totally different context. There, you know, the machine age is over. We're in the post-industrial era. We're in the age of information, and we're in the age of ecology. And nobody can really forget it. You know, most architects are still celebrating the machine in some manner or other. I mean, I think the only way you can do kind of machine age art is ironically. I mean, you can do it as a funny context or humor for something like that. But to take industrialization, industrial tools, and industrial buildings really seriously now is to overlook the bigger issues. Corbusier, of course, back in 1929 was at the cusp of the Industrial Revolution and made the machine for living in. Here was a building like a sculpture, like a combustion engine, very influenced by Cubism and this whole idea of, which was the original and probably only really fundamental revolution in 20th century architecture, was architecture as sculpture. Whereas previously in a Gothic cathedral or a civic building, the sculpture was brought to the building. It came and encrusted the building, enveloped the building, decorated the building, was part of the interior, but it was, the building received the sculpture and the iconography. Corbusier had the idea of making the entire building into a sculpture in itself. So that idea of the building as sculpture became the big revolution. Coming from Cubism, obviously, coming from this idea of new senses of space, overlapping spaces, transparencies, and so forth. So I basically am making this assumption to begin with that the major revolution in architecture was that pivotal moment when the classical convention of using sculpture as a form of surface decoration on a building was exchanged for the concept of an entire edifice treated as a piece of sculpture in itself. And certainly Corbusier was one of the pioneers with Alto and Frank Lloyd Wright and others. Economy of means was really part of all of their work. I mean, if you look, for example, at the Villa Savoye, I mean, that is a very economical, very small building with, like collages of Picasso and Cubism, very influential ideas. Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian houses, they were inspired by the Depression era when you realized you had to make very cheap houses. It's hard to believe that these houses sold for $10,000 or $15,000. And now they're all owned by millionaires. But these were really inexpensive, at that time, economy housing. But, you know, he had a great sense of bringing in nature, a great sense of context, and so forth. You know, the German pavilion by Mies van der Rohe was a very, very simple, small building with enormous conceptual idea impact. You know, the whole layering of transparency and materials all came from that. And then the Schroeder House by Rietveld and de Stijl in general really thought of the idea of the Cubist constructivists, the beginnings of Cubism and constructivism. And then later on, another revolution with Venturi's observations about let's get rid of all that modernist stuff, let's start rethinking architecture and seeing that it is in fact iconic, it receives information, it gives information. And so he wrought complexity and contradiction, and with that did a few buildings, which are in a sense almost humorous and ironic commentary on historicism. You know, the split pediment, the ribbon windows from Corbusier, the Palladian arch over the door, and so forth. So he's playing games with your expectations and sensibility, as he did with his fire station in Columbus, Indiana. But again, drastically simple, interesting ideas, compelling ideas, influential ideas, but a great economy of means. And then he went on to do buildings that were very much using popular iconography and, you know, a pavilion as the American flag and a concert hall with actually a sonata as the building's iconography. So these ideas grew, and then they emerged as postmodernism, which is probably, you're all too young to remember that, but that was about 10 or 15 years ago that prevailed. Michael Graves was the hero of postmodernism and did the public services building. But it was, again, sort of somewhat facetious nods to history, but at the same time celebrating historical artifacts and historical references. The Swan Hotel for Disney, and then, of course, the Charles Moore Piazza Italia. They would claim, I guess, that their irony precluded them being banal, but They were on the borderline, and a lot of architects, were finding that, well, all that historicism, I don't know, that seems to be regressive. And then finally there was the revolution of '88, which was also not progressive, because as Philip Johnson got all excited, broken pediments were yesterday, the revolution is against postmodernism. Michael Gray's 15 minutes are up, and so what did they do? They discovered constructivism. And that was an interesting period because, I was a neo-constructivist sculptor when I was in college, for heaven's sakes, and I couldn't imagine what all the excitement was about because constructivism had been around since about 1910. And, there had been some marvelous work, Chernikov, Melnikov, so forth, and Tatlin's Tower. And so that was but the thing is that it was unbuilt, most of it because of Stalinism, and Stalin really hated modern architecture. In a kind of fascist way, constructivism was thwarted, so it was a rich vocabulary that hadn't been exploited. So sure enough, every architect in the world got on that bandwagon, and now you have, for the last 10 or 12 years, you've had neo-constructivism. This is fine, it's all very well, but as this Libeskind building points out, a building like this or a Frank Gehry structure or so forth used 70 to 80% more steel than is necessary to make the building, to enclose the space. So all of that is waste, and that is the most anti-ecological thing you could possibly do. Plus the materials, aluminum, titanium has the worst toxic waste, I guess, of anything. And so you're using materials and resources in a very flamboyant way to make sculpture, to make basically old-fashioned sculpture. I don't know how familiar you are with the art world, but there's not a self-respecting sculptor alive who would make a sculpture that looks like this anymore. They just don't. They're into performance, they're into, nature, they're into ecology. I mean, I'm part of a show in New York called In Exit Art, and they haven't had a painting on the wall or a sculpture on a pedestal for 15 years, But anyway, that being said, it is wasteful to make big sculpture out of architecture. It really is. And plus it leaks and cracks, and they've had a lot of problems. I think you probably know that the Pompidou Center in Paris, when they had to make the repairs about 10 years ago, it cost more to repair it than to build it in the first place. So these things are people are starting to think about. I mean, this is a flamboyant period. We thought resources were endless, that we go on building like this forever. And this hasn't been built yet. I hope they won't do it, because talk about bad sculpture. This is the pits, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, this is worse than Henry Moore. I mean, it's just like, just nobody does this kind of thing anymore. You don't think this way. Well, anyway, all of that is kind of over. I think I just read that Eugene Cohn has made a statement that, the area of excess is coming to an end, and your generation is going to be far more imaginative. We're probably going to go back to the Duchamp and Picasso sensibility, where you invent ideas with economy of means. At site, we always were kind of small, and we always had to kind of think economically. And the main thing we got interested in was context, the response of architecture to the sociological, psychological, ecological, iconographic influences. Taking stuff, letting the building be a kind of absorption process. So the building isn't the big event. The building's kind of the art, maybe, but it's absorbing things from around it. And I'm just briefly going to show the range of stuff, then we're going to get into more detail. We've done integration of architecture with landscape, nature, inside-outside relationships a lot. We've done lots of pavilions and restaurants. Again, always integrating. I'll discuss some of these in more detail later. But I'm just giving you a cross-section of the kind of things we do. Parklands. We've always felt, for example, in parklands of any kind, you always have to have many elevations, because people love to sit up high and look down on everybody else. So everything we've done with parks and gardens and everything has had that kind of night-day, lower and upper and lower. We've done exhibition centers and museums. That's the Museum of Islamic Art, and that's a water museum that was done for Chattanooga, but never really got off the ground. We've done some corporate building designs. The one on the right is actually public gardens. Then the rich guy was going to live on top, and that had, I'll explain that a little later. It had an interesting construction system. We've done public art. That's the upside-down park in Japan for a children's park, where we cast all the people of the neighborhood. We cast their bottoms, and we suck them in upside down, so you come see your whole family there. you know their shoes and their, you know, the hair on their legs and so forth and so on. You know, so you can identify your neighbors. One at the bottom is a ghost parking lot, which was done for a shopping center. That's a project we did in Vancouver and for the expo, the centerpiece for the exposition in '86. We do bridges and linkages. That's one in Japan and in Chattanooga. We do historic reuse. I mean, our own office in New York was in it, not anymore, but it was in the Louis Sullivan building. We completely restored the interior and built all transparent walls, and that's a project for Frankfurt, taking advantage of an existing ruin and building into it. And then children's play areas, letting children, giving things that inspire children to invent their own games. I mean, giving them the trigger mechanisms to get going. And then finally, water features. We've done quite a bit with water. Water is total environments, water is rivers, because they do attract people enormously, and then sustainable design. So that's our kind of work breadth. We do quite a few different kinds of things. But today we're really basically going to talk about a big problem, the big box. And they're criticized for their opposition to unions, for being environmentally unfriendly. They distribute waste all over the place. They're made from non-renewable resources. Other critics of big box stores simply object because they think they're ugly, since they typically lack landscaping or other ornamental features. And that's the characteristic. They're basically there to sell products, and that's it, with no other social environmental responsibility attached. So when I talk about it today, I'm going to talk about, well, the image area we had a lot of association with, the impact, which is the environmental, which we're definitely into now, and then improvisation, which I'm going to talk about very little because Michael's class is doing the project, so I'm kind of curious to see what improvisations will come out of it. So the first two subjects, image and impact, I'm going to talk about quite a bit. I love these two cartoons. Big box stores discard big boxes which provide shelter for people who lost their homes because they lost their jobs because of big box stores, which I think sums it up perfectly. Walmart put my store out of business, so I had to get a job at Walmart. Thanks to Walmart, I can now only afford to shop at Walmart, enjoy shopping at Walmart. And then Walmart's lower prices, you call these low prices, and the woman's saying, oh, that includes what you pay for my Medicaid. So the big box world is, you know, small businesses can't compete. We don't want Walmart in our town. So that's happening everywhere. You know, people are having real slogans and storming City Hall and everything. You know, they're really against. They consider the big box this huge weight crushing down on their community and destroying everything. So while they're favored in some communities, they're fought against in others. And so it's a big issue. Let's talk about image, brand identity, aesthetic value. Brand identity has become big with them. Target stores have certainly taken up that issue, and they call it thinking out of the box. And they've definitely made inroads to at least better imagery. I'm not sure that they're completely on target. In a way, well, they're innovative stores. Here's John King writing in the San Francisco Chronicle. Their biggest step in using eye-catching design to stand out from the rivals that treat buildings solely as things in which they slap their sign. Rich Varda, who's vice president of design, says, as long as there's a bullseye on the building, we are free to work with the architecture. And then he also says, we don't want anything that's silly or trendy. It has to be timeless. In some centers, that might mean a historicist approach. Well, they picked up the Michael Graves thing, which, as you certainly know if you're a designer, anything Pomo now is the kiss of death. I mean, you know, in New York, all Pomo elevators, all of those little arches and pediments over there are being stripped out of elevators in New York because they're considered so old-fashioned. So the way, you know, Andy Warhol was right, the 15-minute thing is encompass us, which is difficult. So you've got to think of ideas that sort of bridge time, that aren't attached to anything specifically stylistic that you can identify as, oh, I'm part of that style. So neo-constructivism is on the same route, and as, you know, Pomo was in its heyday. So many Target stores do borrow heavily from the Pomo vocabulary, which probably is going to limit their value. Pretty soon they're going to be remodeling again to get rid of that identification. But their logo is excellent, and their merchandising techniques are excellent, and they've certainly been the high end. They're certainly be congratulated on being the high end of that business. But economy means they're not always on top of. And as I say, when CITE started, we started with great economy means. The guy basically told us, don't spend any money. And so that's kind of hard to do. And the company was called BEST. And Sidney and Francis Lewis were very enlightened. They were big art collectors, major art collectors, first order. And they built buildings like this. And they were heavily criticized, not only by the art community, by everybody. Why do you build such ugly stores, merchandising stores, when you're buying all this rich, cachet of art? So they sort of got guilty, and they called me up one day and said, well, James, I said, you got to put art on our buildings. You got to do some art. And their collections were mainly museum art. I mean, they had a great collection of pop art, and I mean, anybody you could think of. They had just key works, really. Jasper Johns, Andy Warhol, Robert Rauschenberg, you name it. And that was part of their collection. Then the other half of their collection was Art Nouveau, Art Deco. And I think this is one of the largest private collections in the world. All of this is in the wing they built on the Virginia Museum. So art was their big interest, and so we started with at least a sympathetic client. But, we were driving around. I mean, we were this among our very first clients. So it's the kind of job a Harvard, GSD student would disdain. They'd rather do their mother's, screen porch than do a shopping center. It's beneath contempt. But I thought that kind of world was interesting. It's where all the people are, that's for sure. And so you'd have an audience for your work. And we noted that everybody did the same thing. They all got, one's painted a different color, or they got a bigger sign, or a different color sign, or a lighted sign. It's all the same language. They're all using the same stuff to make an impact. And one thing I really hated at that time, and I was fearful of that Sidney and Francis might put some sculpture in front of our building. So I had written an article about a year or so before I started working for him for Art in America, and I coined two words in the language, which have remained there. One was plop art, and the other turd in the plaza. And they both remain part of the lexicon of discussing, art and the environment. But I really hated this kind of thing. And Henry Moore was sort of my enemy because I couldn't stand that kind of organic form. It's just it seemed to me represented everything that sculpture should not be about. But anyway, but I showed this picture to Sidney and Francis, and I said, well, you wouldn't want to do anything like that, would you? You wouldn't want to put that in front of your building. And, Sidney said, no, I wouldn't do that. That would take up parking spaces. So, pragmatism won out there. And then I showed him another example. I said, well, what if, would you put something like that? He said, oh, no. I don't want to do anything, historical. He says, that would make our products look too expensive. So actually what we did is we took pretty much this building, one of their prototypes, and we just peeled the wall. We just took Cerebon mortar, which you could play with, and we peeled the wall off. Well, this attracted a tremendous amount of attention. It got into international press, and it got the store off the ground. BEST became identified with buildings as art. Well, the one thing we had done is we obviously accepted the shopping center itself as a subject matter, that use became the embodiment of form, but as art. So unlike the Orbach store, this is interesting. Before we opened the really kind of career-starting building that we did for BEST, 2 months before, Architectural Record had a big article called The Cutting Edge of Shopping Center Design. And they were celebrating Cesar Pelle's work for Orbach. And, he had all the stuff. He had an improved logo. He had good graphics, nice colors, aluminum trim. He had all the stuff. That would made it the cutting edge. So you can imagine how the architectural community reacted to our first building. They hated it. It really is. I mean, if this was published in an American Architecture magazine, the next issue always had these letters from the editor, or to the editor from other architects saying, cancel my subscription. It was really hated. It was the disdain of that world, and totally, absolutely misunderstood. I don't think formalist architects had a clue to what this was about. they always thought it was destruction, ruin. I always tell them it's about destruction and ruin like Giacometti's figures of our starvation. I mean, it's absurd. It's obviously about using the processes of architecture as the subject matter. I mean, you're saying, well, how buildings are built became the iconography. Anyway, it did pretty well. I mean, it did get people's attention. And it was this idea of architecture as a subject matter rather than architecture as a part of a design process. And it was interesting. You know, we had an intern who was putting together our library and collecting all the press on site. And after about a year, this intern was working for us off, and I said, you know, there are over 3,000 articles on that one best building alone in the press. So, I mean, from a standpoint of merchandising, you know, to have global press for one simple, really inexpensive building, I mean, super inexpensive. I think the whole project at that time cost $25,000, $30,000, more than they would have paid. But anyway, people were always doing press articles on it, and they were asking these people in the neighborhood, well, what would you do if Best Products sort of straightened out that wall? And the lady in this house said, oh, I wouldn't like that, then it wouldn't be normal. So, you know, so-called avant-garde art has a way of becoming normal. I mean, people did drive off the highway. It was, you know, if you were in Texas driving by, you would whisk off to see what was going on. And you wouldn't do that for a big sign. You wouldn't do that for a Target store. You wouldn't do it for better color. You wouldn't do it for anything. You'd only do it because there's something subliminal that's changed. And so we got into this idea of architecture, idea, attitude, and context, rather than form, space, and structure. And I always say, if I drop this idea in the boardroom of Target or anybody, they'd shoo me they'd point to the door. There's no question. You just can't bring up esoteric ideas or conceptual thought in that context. You're kind of thrown out. So we really got into this, you know, idea that there are other things before form, space, and structure in architecture. And we dealt, for example, movement. I've always been fascinated with the fact that people move, but the building never does anything. It just sits there. So building a jigsaw puzzle, and we activated this by, the people who did the lunar rover actually did the motor system for this. But you push a button in the morning and the thing gradually opens, you know, opens up the building. And then you have a building and you have a public space. You get 2 for 1. And so that was the second or third building we did. And that also did extremely well. So the budget loosened up. And they let us do more. This is, you know, parking lots are ugly. They never do anything. Why not roll it over the building? So you roll the parking lot over the building, and it means something completely different. It's no longer just a parking lot. It has a whole different, you know, feeling to the experience. This was a building that, you know, I think we can safely claim launched so-called deconstructivism because it happened before the movement started. And then I wrote a book called De-Architecture. But it was interesting. In writing De-Architecture, I was a good friend of Gordon Matta-Clark. If you know his work, you should. You don't know his work, you should. He's a quite exceptional artist who worked with architecture. But he was French background, and he, of course, was very familiar with French philosophers and everything. And he talked often about deconstructivism and that whole idea. And so I had, you know, I was interested in it. And I remember when I was writing De-Architecture, I went to the head of the philosophy department at the New School in New York, and I said, well, you know, I have this great idea. I'm going to compare deconstructivism in philosophy to architecture. And he told me, if you do that, you look like an idiot. And he gave me all the reasons why. So I sort of avoided it a little bit, but in effect, that's what I did. It said basically, you know, deconstructivism is the use of language as the analysis of language. So you're, in a sense, using language to critique it or to uncover meanings that aren't apparent on the surface structure or the surface of language. So it is, you are sort of taking architecture and taking it apart and discovering other meanings. This building did have influence. This one, I must say, is that by this time the architecture community was starting to say, well, okay, I guess they're okay. And, you know, people started picking up on the idea, but I think sort of missing the point. I mean, if you really miss the point, then you're not getting it. And what you try to do is always make it fancier. I've noticed that people who pick up on an idea try to make it formalized or better or whatever. In case of Frank Gehry, you know, started doing tilting buildings, but they're all very formalistic, you can see from those passages. And then Fuchsas tried to make it Pomo. He tried to add a few Pomo elements. But it didn't improve it. I mean, you know, basically an idea is an idea, and it's what it makes you think about. An idea is a very simple thing. It's the bottom line. I always tell students, go back to the dumbest thing you've ever thought. And inherent in that is a great idea. And I tell them always, look at Einstein. You know, Einstein was kind of in Switzerland where everybody talked about time, and he was doing a menial job, and he had to be on time, and everything was time, and talking about time. Finally, he woke up one morning and says, what is time? Nobody can explain what time is. And the rest is history. You know, the theory of relativity and everything grew out of that question. So go back to the gut level. You know, you don't end up with fancy stuff. You end up with, you know, provocative. I mean, these kids are having fun. They don't understand art, but they certainly understand their presence in this structure. After that, they said, well, don't spend any money, do our warehouse. So we did our warehouse. It was interesting. It crossed a county line where you could have a big sign on one side, but on the other side, they didn't allow you to have a sign. So we just blurred it out. So on one side of the county line, it wasn't a sign, and on the other side, it was. And then the most expensive one and the more elaborate one we did, it's one of the last ones, when I've always been fascinated by iconography on a building. And they said, well, you never show what we do. Sidney Lewis was complaining, you know, you do these interesting buildings, but you never show what we do. So I said, okay, we'll show you what you do. So the idea of the iconography was just to cut through the walls and show what they do. And it went right through. See, it went right through the thermal barrier to the outside. So outside, it was all castings of exactly what was inside. So you had a totally inside-outside relationship between the building. And you had people always trying to steal the outside bicycles, you know, except they were pretty firmly fixed. There's an example of the transition from the fire engine, children's fire engine, then the outside version is an extension. So you have the ghost version, the surreal version, and you have the actual version. And kids really loved this project. I mean, parents were not sure what the hell was going on, but the kids liked it. They understood inside, outside. They understood that relationship. That little girl particularly was a fan of this project. So you are picking up, I mean, children do have the imagination to take in ideas, and they lose it as you pound it out of them in places like universities, where you strip them of any originality they might have. But anyway, this building was also extremely successful for the chain, but the most successful were yet to come. We did this one, which is another jigsaw puzzle in Florida. You know, it kind of moved. You could address the building at any scale you felt comfortable with. But this building was hit by Hurricane Andrew. And it was a revelation to me because they called me in the middle of the night, and I was flying down in the morning, and I got there and I saw the damage, and I thought, oh my God, it's better than ever. You know, God, why didn't I think of that? You know, and I realized that nature had outdone me. And then I began to get really interested in nature and what nature could do, and the great creator of everything. And I thought, oh my God, nature's done a better job than it outdid me completely. So I began to retrench and rethink the role of architecture in context, and really re-emphasize that idea. You know, I thought about, well, you know, how do we get information? You know, we never look at the television set. The design of the television set is almost irrelevant. It's the information inside. It's the way it absorbs and communicates. So I thought it'd be interesting to treat buildings the same way, that they could absorb the environment. They could take in trees or people or anything. Architecture would be a filtering zone rather than the big event. It's almost a polar opposite between, you know, so I think of Site's work and a lot of other people's work. We're really all about filtration, and rather than, you know, putting down the big object itself, even though all architecture is a kind of object. So, you know, this had a Hegelian, you know, dialectic going on here, and I warn you all as young architects, don't bring up Hegel and Heidegger and people like that in the boardroom. You know, just never do this to business executives, because they'll throw you out. Anyway, the response to context, going beyond elements which actually exist in favor of thoughts about things whose existence is implied, became a big issue. And then this gets me into this business of impact and environment, and how we really kind of, you know, we were committed to the environment, but more from the standpoint of literature and theory and so forth. And this gave us a real chance to get into it. Walmart is also doing the same thing now, which I want to commend them for doing this. It's interesting that H. Lee Scott, who's the CEO, when they first started, said a Walmart environmental campaign sounded more like a public relations campaign than substance to me. And he was probably right. I mean, an ecological Walmart is an oxymoron. I mean, I don't know how they're going to pull it off. But certainly skylights will help, wind power will help, vegetation will help. They're on a campaign, and if they're on that kick, everybody's soon to follow, because if they can make it work economically, it's a good thing. With Best, we had another opportunity. They were going to build a building right where these big oak trees are. And after they bought the property, the neighborhood said, "You're not taking away these trees. They got to stay." And, you know, for a parking lot oriented merchandiser, that's not a good news. And so we said, "Oh, Sydney, we'll take care of it, we'll take care of it." So what we did was we built the building like they do in Italy, where it's like nature's revenge. Whereas I love the idea in Italy where nature just takes over. And it's not a formal garden exactly, it's just whatever plants and get going and seeded inside the walls or wherever. So having lived in Italy for about 10 years of my life, I really got inspired. I mean, I said, this is a great way to move on the best building. So we're going to put the whole building around the forest. The forest will remain, and it became the inside-outside, ultimate inside-outside. So you're outside, and you walk inside, you're still outside to go inside. And this was the most controversial with the board of directors. They just couldn't see how this would work, why anybody would do this, it's costing money, And I said, well, I don't think people hate trees, I really don't. And to the contrary, this was the most successful building, I think one of the most successful shopping center buildings of all time. They showed me the profit margins on this versus other buildings. And they finally ended up the idea that people bring their picnic lunches, and they go in, they buy their product, and they go out and they have their picnic lunch in the garden, and then they go back in and buy more stuff. So it held on to the customer for a couple of extra hours. And I couldn't believe that no one else in the shopping center world ever picked up on that idea. We never, ever got another job planting trees or leaving trees, just leaving trees. And Michael made an observation that, the Walmarts of the world or the Targets of the world would probably say, well, that's not for us. That's okay for Best, but that's not for us. But I asked that question, are trees really not for anybody? I mean, is there really that much hostility to trees? I was saying earlier today, we had a big committee to try to get the World Trade Center site made into a park. And instead, of course, the Silverstein vision is to build the Freedom Tower, which every self-respecting terrorist in the world is waiting to blow up. The minute that is finished, if not opening day, at least a week later. Whereas in my knowledge, and I mean, no terrorist has ever attacked a tree. So already you have something going for you. You don't have to fear terrorism, right, from the outset. But anyway, nobody ever did this. No boardroom executive ever had the idea that even though Best made all this money from this building, they wouldn't do it. Another nice thing about this building, we went underground. I was always been fascinated by what's happening in the geology underneath. So it was on a hillside, so we did all the thermal walls so you could see the earth underneath. And children loved it because there were all sorts of little worms crawling around, little moles would come to the surface and everything. So you see not only the garden on top, but underground and overground. Well, anyway, this was a really successful place. And then they planted a lot more trees in the outside space in the parking lot. And suddenly, trees became a good thing to do. Then Florida, at Best, we did the same thing. We were taking away a lot of Florida planting, and they said, okay, we'll keep it, we'll bind it up, and we'll replant it in the building, and we made a rainforest. And the water comes down the walls, and it's completely recycled water. And this is when we really realized it kept the building cool. They were doing about 25% less energy here because it really kept the building cool. And we really began to realize that, ecological things, or, there was something called green buildings. And this one was extremely popular because people would park and watch the sunset in the parking lot. Then they go back and buy more stuff because they're already there. So it was really very, very effective. But again, wouldn't you think somebody in Walmart would say, hey, it's a good idea to use water. People like water. But no, nobody said it. Well, anyway, I must say there is a vast difference, I hope you can see it, between the information and the attitude that builds the Target store and what we use to build these big boxes. It is a really difference of attitude. But the big issue now is, of course, the green movement and what we're going to do, because we talked about it in very apocalyptic terms this afternoon. You have the construction of human shelter, which is the biggest consumer of resources. Nearly more than half, almost 2/3 of the world's resources are used for the building of shelter. It uses 1/6 of the world's fresh water, 1/4 of its wood harvest, and 2/5 of its fossil fuels and manufactured materials, to say nothing of its impact on the surface and underground. So as architects, we are in the real enemy camp, the worst camp we could be in. So we also have, I guess, at the same time, a big responsibility. I wrote a book published in 2000. And I'd written several books before, and I always complained that only 5 people and my mother would buy these books. Well, this one really took off. This went into its 5th edition. It was a bestseller for Taschen, and just this last 6 months, Taschen put a hardcover version out as being one of the most successful books of all time. So somebody's interested in green architecture. I don't know who, but somebody in America is interested in it, and probably would translate into the shopping center. I would say that the boardrooms of the big marketing, Costco and so forth, would probably take that as a sign maybe it's a good idea. But I wrote on it from a different perspective. I tried to find a perspective that hadn't been overcovered. I'd been to hundreds of conferences about the environment, and they're basically technology conferences, and I wanted to say something else. And mine was, without art, the whole idea of sustainability fails. People will never want to keep an aesthetically inferior building around, no matter how well stocked it is with green technology, thermal glass, recycled materials, photovoltaic cells, and zero emissions carpeting. And that's really true. To build ugly buildings means they're destined to be removed, torn down, not used, not reused, and so forth. So in that sense of the world, that's a bad thing. Now, the other thing I question a lot, even though we've done one building that falls into this category, is just this decor, vegetation as decor. I question this. I think I welcome vegetation, but I always kind of hope that it's already there, or it's something that seems more natural to the context. We did design for Mumbai, India. It was going to be actually a public garden, which I'll show you in a minute. The one thing I do like is kind of interesting is urban agriculture. Again, I don't know what the economics of Sky Farm are, whether if it were condos, wouldn't it rent for more than if it was a garden? I'm not sure tomatoes generate more money than condos, but we'll see. The lighthouse in Dubai is supposed to be wind powered. We'll see if that works as well. There's a lot of effort even in big buildings to begin to look at them from a green perspective. This is the one we did in India. There were lots of green features. I don't think building anything big is ever green, but these were going to be public gardens on a very small plot of land, and the idea was that the wife of the Ambani family wanted green spaces, like you can visit the gardens at different levels, and they're all based on Vastu principles, Hindu philosophy, and so forth, which I won't go into. But the innovation here was using cable systems to build a building. So you'd put one big truss at the top and the center core, which is the elevator core, of course, and then you stretch the cables, and then you build all the floors on the ground level and hoist them into position, which is a lot more economical than building with cranes and buildings floors in place. So anyway, but the more innovative things in my green architecture book, I thought were buildings like this. You could build for $15,000 or less. I found this in North Wales. I found a lot of economical stuff. The thermal building where all the things towards the outside are the things that don't need to be heated and air conditioned, and as you get toward the core, it's like a thermal onion, so to speak, the onion building. And it's very beautiful. You bring lots of vegetation in, and these are all ideas that are built. This happens to be a residence, but this is all applicable to the big box. These are ideas. Advanced green building demonstration. Pliny Fisk is the head of it, and they're just experimenting all the time. I mean, they must generate an idea a minute out there about how to build with all kinds of materials, all kinds of ecosystems, everything from straw bale to solar collectors to water catchment to whatever. Everything that any respectable green shopping center should be dealing with in these times. This is an interesting idea, and I don't know why nomadic shopping centers aren't possible. This is a nomadic school in France built by Saint-Espace, where it's quite a large space, but it's a monadic, it moves like a tent. It's a very large building, but you can just pick it up, fold it up, and move it around and go to different places. So, you know, for smaller shopping experiences, they could take the building with them. And you could go where the market is, in a sense. So there's something to mobility as well. And there were certainly nomadic societies which knew a lot about moving with the seasons. And then finally, I love this building by Clarence Schmidt. The neighbors burned it down because they didn't like it, which is really a tragedy. But it's collage architecture, it's building with found objects. The biggest single problem of the shopping center is the waste, the tons of waste that are used. Well, then we get into this conversation, rethinking space and adaptive reuse. And this is the part I didn't want to talk about too much because I think this is really, there are some examples I could have shown, but I said, well, I don't want this to be too long anyway, and I just wanted to hint at it because I realized that Michael's class is doing this project. Rethinking space, rethinking adaptive reuse, re-looking at the shopping center, see what they can do. And there's a good book by Julia Christensen, The Big building used to mean meaningful, something meaningful, but big box stores offer size without heft. The buildings exude an ephemeral quality imparted by the frequency with which the corporations vacate the structures, and yet the dead weight of an empty big box building does not simply go away. And as you know, there are hundreds of them. I mean, I don't know how many Circuit City left behind, but probably several hundred. Walmart has 4,000 stores, and I don't know how many abandoned ones. But this idea of implanting these massive structures, ugly beyond conception, absolutely anti-human in every regard, sitting on asphalt that's cracking, no permeable paving, nothing, no redeeming features whatsoever, and they're out there. So this is a mega problem. You know, being in that industry is hard. This is an interesting phenomenon. A church bought the Forest building, and the first thing they did is tear down all the trees. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, what kind of religion is this? I mean, but this all proves my point. There's no, I mean, it's like listening to Rush Limbaugh. There's no limit to human stupidity. I mean, there is no limit. I mean, you know, here's a church, and they took away all the vegetation, took down the big trees, and I guess that purified them or something. You know, there's this purification of the soul or whatever. But in the process, I mean, you know, I wouldn't expect them to have any understanding of art, but they stripped the building of all art value. So it has no value whatsoever now. But it's interesting. Just to show you kind of innovation that's problematic. I mean, they were talking today about, you know, oh, you can't innovate with the shopping center world because everything is fixed. All the systems are fixed, the aisle widths are fixed, the number of products on the shelf are fixed, everything's fixed. And I was telling you earlier a story about McDonald's where we were supposed to design a new McDonald's, and the guy showed us the old one. He said, I understand you're supposed to be innovative. Well, you can be as innovative as you want as long as you don't change anything. So that's kind of the problem you'll often deal with. That was a problem we dealt with in Vienna. We were designing the bookstore for the museum there, and they wanted the bookstore to have access at night so people could go and browse and buy books. And I said, well, can we put a doorway there? And, oh, the city council said, that's a historic building. You can't touch that building. And I began to try to get my imagination working. I said, well, what can I do? And, you know, they can't put a ladder up to the window. What can we do? So what we did was, it was amazing. The city council accepted this because it goes to show you, if you surprise people enough and there's no rule in the book against it, then what you do is you get away with it. And what we did is we just cut the whole side out. I said, look, I preserved everything, including the radiator. Even the radiator is showing respect. So they said, okay, I guess so, you know. So we pulled it off. So, you know, you have to do things like this once in a while. You have to pull it off. You have to use imagination. Well, I'm sure just to conclude this, a few, going back to my original premise, economy of means, things where we were given very strict budgets and we had to be economical. And we pulled it off, and it proved to be very profitable. The Shake Shack, if you've been to New York or if you look at the internet, this is probably the most profitable restaurant In fact, somebody said recently, this is the most profitable restaurant of all time in New York City. If you look on the internet, you'll see that they tell you it's a 1 hour wait in line or a 2 hour wait in line or whatever. But the thing is, it was a very interesting problem because on one hand, we wanted to sort of honor the Flatiron Building and the triangular characteristics of it, which is right at the corner. And we wanted to honor Danny Meyer, who had this sentimentality about the old strip buildings of his youth. He, you know, it was going to be a milkshakes and hamburger building in a park. And then we were told by the New York Parks Department that you can't build anything, not in a public park in New York, not a historic park. So they said, well, you can build it if you don't build it in the park. So here you can't build it in the park. You can't do heavy construction. It has to be park-like. It has to honor the Flatiron Building, and it has to look like the Strip. Now that's your assignment. What would you do? So we put them all together. We made the building in a semi-triangular shape. We twisted the axis. And then we built it all in a factory. It was all factory designed. Very cheap. I guess the smallest and cheapest thing we ever did. The budget was practically zero because it's kind of everybody was kind of charitable about this thing. We used the corrugated metal as a size because it sort of looked like the Flatiron Building. We used this triangular shape. We moved it into the park in 5 pieces. We put it up in 2.5 weeks with all the hookups and everything, so nobody in the Parks Department was offended. And as I say, the rest is history. You can see the line of people. And they even have used the line, the long wait for service, as a virtue because they have all these stories now. They tell, well, I met my mate. I met this gorgeous girl. I was in line for 10 minutes and got laid 20 minutes later. And it's all part of the merchandising. And the thing is incredibly too small. I mean, it's too small for anything like the volume of business is done. But again, it's like the best story. Wouldn't you think, since the Parks Department of New York City is building a lot more kiosks, that somebody would call us up on the phone and say, hey, James, that's a pretty successful kiosk. I think it completely pays for the maintenance of the park. Would you build us an imaginative kiosk? No, no one has ever called. And they still build these awful kiosks, and they don't do much, if they're in a good location, they do some business, but nothing like this. So there is a resistance. That's another thing I'm cautioning you today, is there's a resistance in the business world of doing business. There's an absolute prejudice against profit. And so even in art, particularly art, especially if it comes via art. So, again, this was very successful. Well, another building, and this is talking about conserving energy, using energy. This is a client in Italy who has a big public park, sculpture park. But interesting enough, he has a farm on the same property, so kids come to look at the art and pet the animals, and it's interesting. A farm and an art park at the same time, called Fondazione Rossini, and great patron of the arts, an amazing collection. And for him, his property is all covered with these walls. Like Tuscany is all covered with walls, and so with walls for the animals and walls for the property line and so forth. And so we thought we'd take the wall system and just kind of loop around and make the whole building out of the wall system. And then our second innovation, and this is something shopping centers or anybody could use, is you build an object, you build a component part that becomes the symbol of everything. And we have these cast stone pieces. All the gravel and stone comes from destroyed buildings within everything. In this whole building, the idea was it will come from within a 5-mile radius. Everything will be site-specific, including the gravel and the cast stone, the bricks, everything. And there was a 19th century building that was being torn down, so we utilized that material. So anyway, we met these T-shaped things, and they're great. There can be sculpture bases. You put 4 or 5 of them together, you can make a sculpture base, you can lie them down and make a platform. They can ramble around the property, and they're the component piece of the building. It's all regionally available. As I say, they tore down a 19th century building, so we got these marvelous historic bricks and stone. And you can't find those. I mean, if you go to a preservationist yard or something and try to buy 19th century handmade brick, you pay a fortune. We got all this for free, for one thing. And so this is, you know, it's totally built into the site. We let the hillside come down and become part of the site. We basically just lifted up the site and put it on the roof. You can see it's growing in very well. Now they say you can't even see the building anymore. I haven't seen it for a while, but and it's a pavilion. It's a little restaurant, coffee house, library, video center, underground. All of the, you know, temperature control comes from underground, and it's got a open space in the middle. So in the summer months, the cool air just comes up and it keeps. I don't think they've ever used air conditioning yet, in spite of the fact it's equipped with heating and air conditioning. They've never used the facilities, and we have incredible thermal glass, which was the biggest expense. It really was expensive to do that. But it looks, you know, you can see out, you have a nice view of the property, kind of, and these big pieces ramble out everywhere. You see these posts down at the roadway, you see these big columns, and you know you're there. So everywhere you go in that part of the community, you know you're near the Fondazione Rossini because you know you recognize the icons. And it's my little tribute to Piranesi. I'm a great lover of Piranesi, so I have a little fun with that. And then I said the only real expense in the whole thing is the glass, and because we wanted you to see out, so everything is glass, the stairway, and everything inside is glass or transparent. It's grill walls and kind of wire walls and everything. So there's no place that you can't see the beautiful view. And but all the glass came from a glass factory that was within about 5 kilometers. So if you really want to build green, that's the way to do it. You build with what you have available, and it looks good on the property. That's a monastery in the background. And then finally, I'm going to show you, this is a shopping center, but this is an urban shopping center. We won a big competition in Beijing last March. Because of the economy, this hasn't started. In the meantime, we're doing an exhibition on ecology for the company, New World Land Limited. I think it's the biggest developer in China. And they sponsored a big competition, and we won it, fortunately. And I always love this statement by Jane Jacobs, which is sort of good philosophy for the city, is to approach a city as if it were an architectural problem is to make the mistake of attempting to substitute art for life. The results are neither art nor life, they're taxidermy. And I think that that's a real problem with designing anything, and also bringing life to the city, bringing green to the city. One thing in Beijing is they've, you know, just encroached with this building boom they're on, the shopping centers and the high-rise buildings. They're destroying all the old neighborhoods, and there's a huge battle to keep the traditional lifestyle because the Chinese really are community-oriented, and they're just destroying them right and left. The one on the right here, that kind of compound, is the house of a famous poet, so it's preserved. But that's an old-style community around courtyards and so forth. And so you'd have all your little shops and everything right next to you. You wouldn't have to drive to anywhere. But anyway, it's heavily polluted because of the traffic. The pollution in Beijing is ghastly. You're tearing down these neighborhoods, leaving many people really basically homeless. This is all development. And the whole city has been laid out on a grid, so it's pretty relentless, and that was done in the 12th century. And so we try to, you know, again, pop out of the box and rethink it. And we had a whole series of references that we went to, which come from the historic context, really, the references to nature, which certainly come from Buddhism. They have a tremendous respect for nature. I think it's probably, this probably may be the reason we're doing a cemetery now, we're just starting in Korea. But anyway, we looked at historical references, the yin-yang, the tree, the Yangtze River, the configurations of the river, the cardiovascular system of the body. They all seem to kind of fuse together. And this sort of became the image for the site. You know, it became, we were bringing in a forest on both sides and enclosing it on the ground on an urban floor, I mean, like the floor of the forest. So you had the cardiovascular system, you had the internet, you had everything kind of in one. And that's an overview. It's between shopping centers. That bridge across is a shopping center. And we had to connect shopping centers. So it's a shopping center. It's almost like a suburban shopping center put in an urban situation. And you can see how we've done it more or less like a tree or a growth. And it narrows as it gets to smaller shops in the back. And then there's a bridge over it, an artery, a traffic artery, which is a service road. So you can get an idea of the planning strategy. There's the upper shopping center in the bridge. And basically, it's, the innovation here is this architecture as the plaza. The plaza is it just rises up, you see at the back, and just, this is the only expensive part. It covers another shopping center. And then it connects by stairway, by escalator to the other shopping center. So they're all connected. Very practical innovation. Plus, you open up the grid and you get light into the shopping center. It's all daylighted. And you just simply walk over. And it presides these upper and lower levels, because that's a very important part. We'll see it a little later here, is this upper and lower level. People in parks love to have a higher level where they can watch the people on the lower level. So that became implicit. Then we had a whole ecological plan. All permeable paving, all water catchments. You see water catchments are under the whole plaza, everywhere. And on the rooftops. We're going to put on the rooftops on adjacent buildings. And then, of course, the big urban forest. And then the connection to the upstairs and upper and lower shopping centers. So it all connected together. It was a fusion of walking surface with architecture, where the building is the plaza and the plaza is the building. And here you can see how this is the mound part. There's an access road on the side, but they're not going to have many cars going through. They're thinking of just eliminating cars altogether. But you know, you can. It's really a context, and you're always kind of on a slight slope. So and then it comes down into a basin, and then there's lots on the sides. You see over here, there's all sorts of cafes and more intimate relationships to the surrounding buildings. That's going up to the other shopping center, and then you have varied pavings. You know, this is very organic. The only real expense is just the artery itself, making cast stone artery. And then the planting of the trees and everything's all provided for. We've done quite a bit of this in our other work, you know, a lot of planting, using only trees that grow in that area, only vegetation that grows there. And there's quite a few urban forest archetypes, I would call them, in other communities. In Canada and Riverside, Illinois, we found a lot of real urban forests where they just brought forests to the city. And they're incredibly invigorating and incredibly healthy, and everybody loves them. I mean, you know, whether they ever repeated our forest building or not, even Walmart is going to have to start loving trees. So anyway, our environmental features responded to the seasonal character of the city with the trees. It had a forest floor, you know, multiple materials in the floor, all kinds of, you know, things you could walk on or sit on, photovoltaic panels for electricity, and LED lights. You could have, you know, bus shelters. You could have seated areas, all part of the same language. You see it all cohesive, part of the same language. Even bridges over the artery, you know, the traffic artery. We've done that before. We've built bridges. It's Chattanooga. One is an amphitheater in the background. One is a bridge over the park. Very, very helpful. I mean, and what's interesting here, you see, and we've done this several times, is by having a thin edge, it looks lightweight, but actually it bellies in the middle, and you can plant quite large trees. So you can get a lot of vegetation, and then just let it grow. I mean, there's practically no maintenance to speak of in something like this, but you can see that people sit under it. In Chattanooga, it's 25 degrees cooler under this bridge, and all the old people sit there and just watch the people go under the bridge. And it's very practical. We covered all the service units the same way in Tennessee. And so this is a good way to build. And the insulation, I mean, you can do it now. You never get a leak. You don't have any problems. The rainwater, the support systems, there's all the technologies there for this kind of thing. And this is to make it look like a forest at night, we're going to have the LED lights are going to be, the whole pole is going to be lighted. Anyway, the idea that the company they wanted a design approach to public space that could be used in multiple situations. So you could change the park and put it in other parts of the city. So we figured that in an urban grid, you could always have this kind of, you know, this cardiovascular system. It worked pretty well. And these are the images again. And it was interesting. I just read in the New York Times Review, they were talking about the new internet, and they used our image. So the image is a kind of internet symbol. And that's another thing. You know, it's an urban forest, but vertically, horizontally, physically, symbolically, experientially, and ecologically. And this is I'm just showing an idea that could be applicable to the shopping center world. In fact, it is a shopping center. Well, anyway, to me, just to conclude, environmental thinking is integrative thinking. It's a very, very powerful force. This is not integrative thinking. This is the history of architecture, I guess, right now. And I dread it a little bit because, as you know, some of these buildings, the maintenance is already becoming formidable because, you know, in many cases, you know, they're trying to make flat metal shapes curve over surfaces, and they tend to want to return to their original shape. I think it was Lou Kahn always asked the question, what does a brick want to do, or what does a brick want to be? And you have to build a kind of, the old ways is kind of the good ways, because they figured out what bricks want to be and what stones want to be and what simple materials. So it's their attitude towards it. Duchamp and Picasso did not do anything very innovative with media itself. They didn't, it wasn't new technology. It was just changing the way you think. And so I'm always amazed that the computer is used to make old-fashioned form. Why use a technology like that? And also vegetation. I asked this question in an article I wrote. It says it's a rule of thumb in environmental circles that one tree means 4 people can breathe. So just based on the health argument alone, it raises the question concerning why plants and trees in architecture are reduced to the status of mere decor or eliminated altogether as superfluous intrusions. Part of the answer goes back to the earliest influences of Cubism and constructivism, when the notion of architecture as a work of abstract sculpture, which is true. I mean, you scratch any architect and you find an abstract sculptor. It became synonymous with good taste. It's all about good taste, they're old-fashioned good taste. Ironically, these 1920s stylistic origins are usually dismissed by the contemporary art world as hopelessly old-fashioned, especially when resurrected in the tradition of Henry Moore, Max Bill, or Jean Arp, like organic shapes in sculpture. While architects enthusiastically embrace these same sources of form as a meanings of cutting-edge emancipation. And since I have so many people here today, I'm presenting this at the end of every lecture just to inspire you to go on. Let's get out of the 20th century. It's over, done with, finished. They've done it all. You can re-explore it as history, but you know, we've got to go on. If I were your age again, I'd definitely start over and go on to something. I mean, all these shapes, constructivism and abstract art and organic shapes and whatever, have been done since 1910. So it's 100 years old. The forms that dominate architectural language now, the dreaded Beaux-Arts, the much disdained Beaux-Arts in Paris only lasted 30 years. And then it was wiped out by the modern movement as being, you know, we don't want to do that stuff anymore. So this language that we're all subjected to has been done well, incredibly well by sculptors. And the language now is this. We're in the age of information, we're in integrated systems, computer technology, cyberspace. This is one set of imagery, and then there's this set of imagery. These are the leading sources of ideas. It looks like this, or it looks like that. And actually, they're very similar. They have the same integrated systems. The way technology works, the way computers work, really work, is by integrated systems. And the way nature works is by integrated systems. So anybody could, you would think, would make that equation. That's a very, very obvious, you know, evaluation of the situation. So, you know, I'm saying, really, as I say, I have another lecture which I show all my early sculpture, which is sort of embarrassing, but you know, I dumped all that stuff. I woke up one morning and said, how can you make constructivist shapes anymore? Who could possibly be inspired by doing what was done so well in the 1920s? You can't, there's not a new language. So you have integration, fusion, interaction, connection, symbiosis, ecosystems, wireless systems. This is the sources. And I even listed them here. In nature, it's biochemistry, hydrology, geology, meteorology, botany, geography, topography, cosmology, and in communications is computer technology, cybernetics, pop culture, television, virtual reality, mass media, digital systems, and the internet. And they all go together. And if you're really, really imaginative, your sources will come in the time in which you live. And I always ask, if you're going to build green, why not show it? I mean, we always tell that to clients. I mean, if you're going to build something green, why not show it? One is, of course, the building I showed you, and the other is in Seville. It's a park, but it's so engulfed with green. I mean, it's so much cooler and pleasanter to be a place to be. And if you're interested in my book, please read it. It's still around. And you know, I advise you to respond to context, regional identity. This is if you're doing big boxes, cultural resources, people interaction, psychology of situation, climatic and ecological imperatives, and fusion of art, architecture, and landscape. And please take my advice, don't take this to the boardroom, just keep this among yourselves, but do it. Get out there and do it. These are, again, 2 books, recent books on site. There are about 20, 22 monographs, but these are the most recent ones if you're interested in reading them. One is called Identity and Density, and the other is in Italian, but it has an English text as well. This is our office. Brandon was just an intern at that time, but this is the hardcore. My daughter Suzanne, who has her own architectural firm. Sarah Stracy's an artist. That's the boss sitting there in the lower level. My wife Chris, who's the accountant, who, as she says these days, why is only the money going out and not coming in? Josh Weinstein, my partner of 25 years, 30 years almost. Denise Lee from Hong Kong, who runs the office. And Stomo Miyazaki, who's an architect and our incredible model builder. And our new people, almost everybody new in our office is from Asia. And my advice is, if you are hiring anybody, hire Asia. First of all, I want to be getting, when Asia takes over the world, I want to be on the good side. And so, because my experience, having worked with Asians now for quite a few years, is any average Asian student can do in an hour what it takes a Westerner 6 hours to do. I don't know why. But the computer skills and the intensity of work, and our office never closes before 10 o'clock at night. And they're still working. And so it's a work ethic, and it's also an intensity. It's wonderful to have around you. And I love this because I think it could be hearkened, even though it's esoteric and by the Dadaist Manifesto, I think the shopping center world could listen to it. Art and its execution and direction is dependent on the time in which it lives. And artists are creatures of their epoch. The highest art is that which, in its conscious content, presents the problems of the day. Thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions or comments for James. So if anybody does, please ask us.
Yeah, I talked a lot with the big box people today, so we had a really decent dialogue, and we kind of covered the waterfront. Those poor people must be exhausted, but if there are any other burning questions, I can take them on.